Let's dive into one of history's most bizarre and, frankly, terrifying events. We're going back to the summer of 1518, when an entire town was gripped by an unstoppable urge to dance. And this wasn't a party. It was a plague that drove people to literally dance themselves to death. So let's get into what really happened.
Let me just ask you this straight up. Could you actually dance yourself to death? It sounds like something out of a dark fairy tale, right? But for hundreds of people back in 1518, this was not some hypothetical question. The answer, as they found out, was a horrifying yes.
So where did all this madness begin? Well, it didn't start with a giant crowd, like you might think. This whole citywide panic was actually sparked by just one person. Okay, so try to picture this. It's a hot July day in the city of Strasbourg. A woman, who history knows as Frau Troffea, just walks out of her house into the middle of the street and starts dancing. There's no music, no festival going on. It's just her making these silent, frantic movements.
And this is where it gets really, really weird. She didn't stop. I'm not talking for a few hours, I mean for days. She would dance until she literally collapsed from exhaustion, and then, as soon as she got a tiny bit of strength back, she'd get right back up and start all over again. For almost a full week, she was just trapped in this non-stop, horrifying dance.
But Frau Troffea wasn't alone for very long. What started as this really disturbing solo performance quickly turned into a public spectacle. And then, for reasons nobody could figure out, it started to spread. It moved through the crowds like some kind of invisible virus.
Just look at how fast this thing escalated. In the middle of July, you've got one dancer, our Frau Troffea. But by the end of that same month, she's been joined by over 30 other people. And then, by August, the city is staring at a crowd of up to 400 people, all dancing uncontrollably in the streets. Seriously, let that number sink in for a minute. 400 people. Not at a concert, not at a wedding. They were caught in this agonizing, non-stop dance mania. The whole city was in a state of absolute chaos.
And we have to be clear, this wasn't some joyful, happy dance. This was torture. People were dancing until their feet were bloody stumps, until their bones were literally breaking. Historical records say that people were dying from strokes, heart attacks, and just pure, unrelenting exhaustion.
So, the most obvious question here is why, right? What on earth could cause hundreds of people to dance themselves to death? This is where our investigation really begins.
For centuries, this whole event has just baffled historians and scientists. The theories are all over the place, from the supernatural to the scientific. So let's go through the main suspects.
For the people actually living through this in 1518, the most logical explanation was something supernatural. They were convinced the dancers were cursed, maybe by a saint, specifically Saint Vitus, who was apparently known to inflict plagues of compulsive dancing on anyone who ticked him off.
Okay, so as time passed, a more scientific theory started to pop up. Poison. Could the dancers have accidentally eaten something that caused these bizarre symptoms? Some kind of toxin in their food supply? It actually sounds pretty plausible. And there's even a specific culprit, a fungus called ergot. It can grow on damp rye, which was a huge part of their diet back then. Poisoning from this stuff is called ergotism, and it's known to cause really bad muscle spasms, seizures, even hallucinations. On the surface, it seems like a perfect match, right?
But here's the thing. When you really compare the symptoms side by side, that whole poison theory starts to fall apart. Ergot causes jerky, random spasms, not the weirdly coordinated dancing that was reported in Strasbourg. Plus, it restricts blood flow to your limbs, which would make it pretty much impossible to dance for days on end. The evidence just doesn't line up.
So if it wasn't a curse and it wasn't poisoned, what did the people in charge think was going on? Well, their official diagnosis was something called hot blood, an old medical theory about the body's fluids being out of whack. And their prescribed cure was, you're not going to believe this, more dancing.
No, I'm serious. They actually doubled down on the problem. They cleared out public squares, they built a wooden stage, and they even hired professional musicians to keep the music going. Their thinking was that if they just let the victims dance it out, the fever would eventually break. But instead, all this did was encourage more people to join in and push the people who were already dancing to the point of total collapse. It was a catastrophic failure.
Which brings us to what is now the most widely accepted modern theory. And this one has nothing to do with curses or poisons. It has everything to do with the power of the human mind when it's under extreme stress.
It's a phenomenon called mass psychogenic illness. You might have heard of it as mass hysteria. This is basically when extreme psychological distress starts to manifest as real physical symptoms. And the craziest part is, it can spread like a contagion just from seeing other people who are affected.
So why was Strasbourg in 1518 so vulnerable to this? Well, the city was basically a psychological tinderbox just waiting for a spark. They had been through brutal famines, diseases like smallpox and syphilis were everywhere, there was crushing poverty, and this overwhelming feeling of dread, all of it wrapped up in really powerful superstitions. People were living under a level of stress that is honestly hard for us to even imagine today.
So here's the bottom line. The dancing plague probably wasn't a plague at all, at least not in a medical sense. It was a social phenomenon. It was this desperate, subconscious collective response to a world filled with just unbearable suffering. The dance was like a trance, a psychological escape hatch for an entire community that was at its absolute breaking point.
Now, we might not see dancing plagues breaking out today, but the story of Strasbourg is a pretty chilling reminder of how communities can fracture when they're under extreme pressure. It really forces us to ask ourselves, what are the breaking points for our modern society, and how might our own collective stress show itself?